T1D, Authorized and Prohibited Transmissions, communications with other countries, music, encryption, indecent language, compensation, broadcasting, and sale of equipment. 11 questions. With which countries are FCC licensed amateur radio stations prohibited from exchanging communication? The answer is A, any country whose administration has notified the ITU that it objects to such communications. You are prohibited from communicating with stations in countries whose administration have notified the ITU that they object to such communications. The ITU maintains this list, and it can change over time. Under which of the following circumstances are one-way transmissions by an amateur station prohibited? B. Broadcasting. Broadcasting transmissions intended for reception by the general public is prohibited in the amateur radio service. One-way transmissions are allowed for specific purposes like beacons, telecommand of model craft, and emergency communications, but not for broadcasting. When is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to obscure their meaning? B. Only when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio control craft. Encoding messages to obscure their meaning, or encryption, is only permitted when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio control craft. All other communication must be transmitted in the clear. The intent is that amateur transmissions be openly receivable. Under what conditions is an amateur station authorized to transmit music using phone emissions? B. When incidental to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communications. Music transmission is generally prohibited on amateur radio. The sole exception is when the music is incidental to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communications. For example, when NASA plays music as a wake-up call to astronauts and it's being retransmitted. When may amateur radio operators use their stations to notify other amateurs of the availability of equipment for sale or trade? B. When selling amateur radio equipment and not on a regular basis. You may use your amateur radio station to announce equipment for sale or trade, but only if it's amateur radio equipment and the activity is not conducted on a regular basis. Running a commercial sales operation over amateur radio is prohibited. What, if any, are the restrictions concerning transmissions of language that may be considered indecent or obscene? B. Any such language is prohibited. Any language that is indecent or obscene is prohibited on amateur radio. Unlike some broadcast regulations that restrict such content to certain hours, amateur radio prohibits it entirely at all times. What types of amateur stations can automatically retransmit the signals of other amateur stations? A. Repeater, auxiliary, or space stations. Only repeater, auxiliary, or space stations are authorized to automatically retransmit signals of other amateur stations. Regular amateur stations cannot set up automatic retransmission without being designated as one of these station types. In which of the following circumstances may the control operator of an amateur station receive compensation for operating that station? B. When the communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. The only situation where compensation is allowed is when the communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institute. A teacher who is a licensed amateur may be compensated as part of their teaching duties that happen to include amateur radio instruction. When may amateur stations transmit information in support of broadcasting, program production, or news gathering, assuming no other means is available? B. When such communications are directly related to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. Amateur stations may support broadcasting, news gathering only when the communications are directly related to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property and no other means is available. This is a narrow emergency exception to the general prohibition. How does the FCC define broadcasting for the amateur radio service? A. Transmissions intended for reception by the general public. The FCC defines broadcasting as transmissions intended for reception by the general public. The key word is intended. While anyone can listen to amateur radio, the transmissions must not be specifically directed at the general public as an audience. When may an amateur station transmit without identifying on the air? D. When transmitting signals to control model craft. An amateur station may transmit without identifying when sending signals to control model craft. This is one of the few exceptions to the identification requirement. The rationale is that telecommand signals for model craft are brief control signals and not communications. The key takeaways: broadcasting transmissions intended for the general public is always prohibited. Encryption is only allowed for controlling space stations or radio-controlled craft. Music is only allowed when incidental to authorized manned spacecraft retransmissions. Indecent or obscene language is prohibited at all times, no exceptions. Equipment sales can be announced only for amateur equipment and not on a regular basis. Compensation for operating is only prohibited incidental to classroom instruction.